A racist police officer brazenly stopped a car and insulted a black man, deeming him unworthy of belonging in that place, unaware that the man was, in fact, the chief of police. When the truth was revealed, the officer was left speechless. This story is not merely a dramatic confrontation, but also a profound lesson on the value of justice, the strength of courage, and the journey toward dismantling prejudice. Before diving into this compelling tale, share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Elmwood, a small town nestled among rolling green hills, was once known for its peace and simplicity, where people lived modest and gentle lives. Yet beneath its tranquil facade lies a complex and painful history. Elmwood had long been a site of racial tension simmering for decades, leaving deep scars within the community. Hidden conflicts over race, class, and power had fractured the town profoundly. 10 years ago, Elmwood was shaken by a major scandal within its police force. A group of senior officers was exposed for abusing their power, covering up numerous acts of violence against minority communities. Internal reports were leaked, investigations brought truths to light, and top police officials were forced to resign. The scandal ignited protests and shattered public trust in Elmwood's justice system. Many residents began to see the police not as symbols of justice, but as agents of oppression. Amid this turmoil, James Carter emerged as a beacon of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness of doubt and disillusionment. James, a black man, had just been appointed Elmwood's chief of police, the first in the town's history to hold this position. His appointment was a bold move by the new administration, signaling a commitment to change and the restoration of public trust. But for James, this was not just a job. It was a mission, a profound responsibility tied to his very identity. James grew up in Elmwood's ghettos, where people like him, black residents, were often treated as second-class citizens. His childhood was filled with days of watching his parents toil tirelessly to put food on the table and enduring overt discrimination in the very town they called home. James vividly remembered a life-altering event when he was just 10 years old. One evening, his father was pulled over by a group of police officers while driving home, simply because he was a black man behind the wheel of a car they deemed too nice for someone like him. He was dragged out of the car, interrogated, and humiliated in front of young James, despite explaining that he was a hard-working laborer who had just received a modest bonus. James stood there, powerless, watching his father be degraded. From that moment, a quiet fire ignited within him, a resolve to change the system that perpetuated such injustice. Becoming a police officer was not an easy decision for James. He knew the path would be fraught with challenges. As one of the few black officers in the force, James faced skepticism from both his colleagues and his community. But through patience, determination, and a steadfast belief in justice, James rose above these obstacles. Over 25 years of service, he not only demonstrated his competence but also earned a reputation as a fair and principled leader. Now, at the age of 50, James stepped into the role of chief of police with a mix of pride and pressure. He was acutely aware that every move he made was under scrutiny, watched closely by those who hoped for change and those waiting for him to fail. Yet, James refused to falter. He understood that this role was not just about him, but also about people like his father, those who had been forgotten and marginalized. On the morning of his first day as chief, James stood for a few moments in front of the mirror, gazing at his reflection in his new uniform. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, a reminder that his work was not merely about enforcing laws but about protecting hope and restoring trust within a community. He whispered to himself, "Today is not just my day. It's the day of everyone who has ever been overlooked." Driving to the police station, James carried with him not just his aspirations, but also the collective hopes of a town yearning for change. Elmwood, with all its pain and division, was poised to write a new chapter. And James Carter was the one holding the pen to craft its story. As the morning light poured through the window, James Carter took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his first day settle on his shoulders. Outside, the town of Elmwood remained quiet, but within James's mind, a storm of thoughts and emotions brewed. He knew that today was not just about stepping into a new office. It was the day he had to prove that the hope placed in him was well-founded. James walked into the kitchen where his 17-year-old son Nathan was having breakfast. Nathan, a younger version of James with curious eyes and a calm demeanor, was visibly anxious as he looked at his father in the crisp new police uniform. "Dad, are you nervous?" Nathan asked hesitantly. James sat down across from his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Of course I am, son. How could I not be? But pressure isn't always a bad thing. It reminds us that what we're doing is important." Nathan stared at his father for a moment before quietly saying, "I just worry that they won't accept you, that what you're trying to change is too much." James chuckled softly, though his eyes carried a depth of understanding. "You know, Nathan, people aren't afraid of change because it's hard. They're afraid of it because it forces them to confront their own mistakes. I know there will be those who disagree with me, even resist me, but that doesn't mean I won't do what's right." Nathan hesitated for a few seconds, then asked, "What if they refuse to change?" James leaned back, thoughtful. "When I was young, your grandfather always told me, if you can't change the whole world, change your corner of it." I can't change everyone in one day, Nathan, but I can start with myself and the things I can control. The two sat in silence for a while. Finally, Nathan said, "I'm proud of you, Dad. Really." James felt the sincerity in his son's words. He placed a hand on Nathan's head, gently ruffling his hair as he used to when Nathan was little. "Thank you, son. That means more to me than any compliment from anyone else." Before leaving the house, James stepped into his small study where he prayed every morning. Standing before the old wooden desk, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, I know I am not perfect, but I ask for the strength to do what is right, no matter how hard it is. Help me remember that today is not about me, but about all the people I represent." Then he opened his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. His black SUV gleamed in the morning sun, a symbol of his new beginning in Elmwood. Before getting into the car, James turned back to look at his modest yet warm home. Nathan stood in the doorway waving, his eyes filled with faith. Gripping the steering wheel, James drove off, his mind filled with plans, ideas, and a measure of uncertainty about what lay ahead. He was not simply preparing for polite handshakes or hollow congratulatory words. James knew he would face skepticism, resistance, and perhaps even hostility from some within the very team he was meant to lead. But he also knew that this was his chance to start a new chapter, not just for Elmwood, but for himself as well. As he neared the police station, James envisioned walking through its large doors and meeting his team for the first time. He reminded himself that first impressions must be strong. More than a leader, James wanted them to see him as someone willing to act, someone who stood unwaveringly for justice. The sky over Elmwood was clear that day, but in James's heart, he knew the storm of challenges would soon arrive. Yet, as he had told Nathan, pressure was not a bad thing. It was simply a reminder that his work was both righteous and necessary. James Carter's SUV glided smoothly along the road leading into downtown Elmwood. Towering old trees cast shadows under the morning sun, but James's mind was focused on the speech he was preparing to deliver to the police force. He reminded himself that this was his chance to establish respect and trust from day one. However, his concentration was interrupted by the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A siren blared, and in the mirror, he saw a patrol car signaling him to pull over. James frowned but remained calm. He knew he had broken no traffic laws. Slowly, he reduced his speed and pulled to the side of the road, carefully placing his hands on the steering wheel to avoid any misunderstanding. From the patrol car behind, a heavy-set, middle-aged man stepped out. It was Officer Mark Grayson, a familiar face in the Elmwood police force, not for any notable accomplishments but for his rude behavior and discriminatory attitudes. His faded uniform and cold, arrogant expression spoke volumes of his long-standing hubris. Grayson approached the SUV, his gaze shifting quickly from suspicion to contempt as he saw James, a black man, behind the wheel. "This car doesn't look like something someone like you should be driving," Grayson said gruffly. "License and registration." James looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't believe I've broken any laws, officer. Is there a problem?" Grayson smirked, barely hiding his disdain. "Don't ask questions, just comply. Papers." James took a deep breath, retrieved his documents from the glove compartment, and handed them over. The officer flipped through them carelessly, clearly searching for an excuse to cause trouble. "Out-of-town plates," Grayson remarked, his tone heavy with insinuation. "What are you doing in Elmwood?" "I'm here for work," James replied, his voice steady. "Work where?" Grayson pressed, clearly disbelieving. "At the Elmwood Police Department," James said, his gaze unwavering. Grayson let out a derisive laugh, stepping back slightly. "You think I'll buy that? Someone like you, working at the police department? Don't make me laugh." James gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling anger rise within him. But he knew losing his composure would only worsen the situation. "I've answered your questions and provided my documentation. Unless you have a valid reason, I believe I'm free to go." James's firm words ignited Grayson's temper. He jabbed a finger in James's face, raising his voice. "You're telling me how to do my job? Get out of the car, now." James remained still. "You have no legitimate reason to make that request. This is an abuse of authority." James's calm assertion further enraged Grayson. He pulled his gun from its holster and aimed it directly at James. "Out of the car, on your knees. Right now, or I'll show you who's really in charge here." The situation grew unbearably tense. James held Grayson's gaze, calm and unyielding. Just then, a young woman named Sarah, passing by, stopped and began recording the incident on her phone. "I'm filming this. You better think twice about what you're doing," she called out, drawing the attention of both men. What does Grayson's behavior in this situation reveal about the system? In your opinion, what would be the most effective way to prevent similar abuses of power in the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Grayson glanced at Sarah, clearly agitated but refusing to lower his weapon. "This isn't your business. Move along." Sarah stood her ground. "No, I'm not leaving. This is misconduct, and I'll make sure everyone knows about it." Realizing he was losing control of the situation, Grayson grabbed his radio and called for backup. "Get over here now. I've got a suspicious individual and need assistance." As they waited, Grayson kept his gun trained on James, though his hands now trembled. James locked eyes with Grayson, his voice low but firm. "You just made a big mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Moments later, a second patrol car arrived. Officer David Martinez stepped out, only to freeze in shock when he recognized James. "Grayson, what are you doing?" Martinez asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Just handling a suspicious individual," Grayson replied, though his confidence had noticeably faltered. Martinez turned to James, immediately grasping the gravity of the situation. "Sir, are you Chief Carter?" James nodded, his gaze still cold. "Yes, I am, and he just pulled a gun on me without any justification." Martinez took a deep breath, clearly unnerved. He turned to Grayson, his voice urgent. "Put the gun down, Grayson. You're making this worse." Grayson hesitated for several seconds before slowly lowering his weapon. James stepped out of the SUV, standing tall before Grayson. "What's your name?" James asked, though he didn't need the answer. He had already read the name on Grayson's badge. "I'll see you at the station," James said, his tone sharp as a blade, "and you'd better be prepared to face the consequences." The air on Elmwood's quiet street seemed to freeze after James Carter's declaration. Grayson, who moments ago had exuded arrogance and self-assurance, now looked utterly shaken. His confidence evaporated, leaving behind a face marked with confusion and fear. The gun in his hand hung limp, his trembling fingers unsure of their place. "You're the chief of police?" Grayson stammered, his voice hoarse, his eyes searching James's face for some error in his words. James took a step closer, his gaze cold and commanding, cutting through Grayson's composure. "That's correct," James said, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm James Carter, the new chief of police for Elmwood, and you just pulled a gun on me without any legitimate reason, driven only by your prejudice and abuse of power." Grayson stood frozen, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to form words. Whatever excuses he attempted to muster died under James's unrelenting stare. For Grayson, the seconds stretched into an eternity as the reality of his actions set in. Taking a steady breath, James continued, his voice firm and resonant. "You realize, Officer Grayson, your actions today weren't just a personal insult to me. They tarnished the integrity of the entire Elmwood Police Department. When you aim a weapon at an innocent person without cause, you don't just disgrace yourself. You destroy the fragile trust our community has fought so hard to rebuild." Grayson bit his lip, his hands now shaking visibly. He lowered his head, unable to meet James's eyes. But James wasn't finished. His words cut through the air like a blade. "Do you think this only harmed me? Imagine what the people of Elmwood will think when they learn that one of their officers so readily threatened an innocent man. Will they see a force that protects them, or a system rotten with abuse, where power is wielded by men like you?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but James raised a hand to silence him. "No, let me finish. If you think I'll overlook this because it's my first day, think again. Let this be clear. The days of excusing misconduct like this are over. You don't have to respect me, but you will respect the badge you wear, and you will respect the law." Sarah, still filming from the roadside, didn't speak, but her expression radiated approval. A light breeze rustled the trees, but no one noticed the sound. All attention was locked on the tense confrontation unfolding before them. Grayson swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "Chief, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaking, but James cut him off. "That's right. You didn't know," James said, his tone heavy with authority. "And that's what worries me. A police officer who doesn't think before he acts, especially while holding a gun, has no place in this force." Martinez, standing nearby, stepped forward, his face filled with concern. "Chief Carter, I understand how serious this is. I'll make sure Grayson returns to the station immediately to provide a full account." James nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Good. And make sure he understands that there will be consequences, not just a reprimand. This is his final warning." Turning back to Grayson, James added, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for argument. "This is a lesson for you, Grayson. Power is not a weapon to intimidate and demean others. If you fail to grasp that, then you have no place in this department. Remember, anyone at any time can be replaced." Grayson lowered his head, silent. Martinez gently guided him toward the patrol car. James watched them leave, disappointment flickering in his eyes, though he felt satisfaction at having resolved the situation without escalation. Before returning to his SUV, James paused by Sarah. "Thank you for standing there," he said, his tone softer. "People like you are why I still believe Elmwood has hope." Sarah nodded, her smile warm and encouraging. "We need people like you, Chief Carter. Good luck." James climbed into his SUV, taking a deep breath before driving off. In the rearview mirror, he saw Sarah still standing, her phone in hand. He knew the events of that morning would soon spread across Elmwood, and likely beyond. But he also understood that change often required confronting such challenges head-on. His first day was far from over, but the message had been delivered. Elmwood was entering a new chapter where justice would no longer compromise. James Carter drove to the Elmwood Police Department in a state of quiet focus. The events of the morning served as a stark reminder that the road ahead would not be easy. As his SUV rolled into the parking lot, he noticed a group of officers gathered near the main entrance. They appeared curious about the first day of their new police chief, though their expressions betrayed an undercurrent of wariness. Stepping out of the vehicle, James scanned the faces waiting for him. Some offered tentative smiles, but many bore looks of skepticism. Ignoring the mixed reception, he strode purposefully through the lobby, where other officers stood in clusters, silently observing. He stopped at the small podium typically used for morning briefings at the start of each shift. "Gather around," James commanded, his voice firm but not raised. Slowly, the officers formed a circle, their eyes fixed on him. "Before we begin the day," James started, his tone steady and resolute, "I need to address something that happened this morning. On my way here, I was stopped by one of our own, Officer Mark Grayson, without any legitimate cause. And it didn't end there. He drew his gun on me." The room grew heavy with silence. Some officers exchanged startled glances, while others appeared uncomfortable. Yet no one spoke. "This isn't personal," James continued. "It doesn't matter who I am in this situation. What matters is that such behavior is completely unacceptable toward anyone. No officer has the right to abuse their authority, let alone act based on prejudice." A scoff broke the silence from the back of the room. John Miller, a seasoned officer with over 20 years on the force, stepped forward, his demeanor challenging. "With all due respect, Chief, don't you think this should be handled internally? Suspending a veteran officer like Grayson without thorough consideration could hurt team morale." James turned to face Miller, his gaze cold yet composed. "Morale," he repeated, his tone cutting. "I think the team's morale is far more damaged when one of us uses their badge to intimidate others. That doesn't just reflect poorly on Grayson, it reflects poorly on all of us." Miller raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. James pressed on, his voice growing firmer. This isn't about personal grievances or internal politics. This is about accountability and integrity. If we aren't willing to hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? A few officers nodded in agreement, though murmurs of dissent lingered. James took note of the reactions, understanding that change would not come easily. "This is my decision," James declared, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Officer Grayson has been immediately suspended, and an internal investigation has been ordered. We will not tolerate any actions that compromise the honor and responsibility of this department." Miller stepped closer, his tone more confrontational. "Chief Carter, I'm not excusing what Grayson did, but he's a skilled officer. Are we going to ruin his career over one incident? He's served for over 20 years. Maybe it was just a moment of poor judgment." James held Miller's gaze unyielding. "A moment of poor judgment can cost an innocent life. You call it a mistake. I call it a danger. And if anyone in this team believes they can act that way without consequences, they have no place in the Elmwood Police Department." The tension in the room thickened, but this time no one dared to respond. James exhaled deeply, his eyes meeting each officer's. "I'm not here to pick a fight with any of you. I'm here to do what's right. We cannot change Elmwood's past, but we can decide how we act moving forward." Turning to Martinez, who stood nearby, James instructed, "Martinez, I want a full report on this morning's incident on my desk by the end of the day. We'll handle this transparently." Martinez nodded, visibly relieved by James's firmness, yet fairness. Miller, though still visibly displeased, said nothing further and retreated into the crowd. James ended the meeting with a final note. "If any of you feel you can't work under my leadership, I won't force you to stay. But remember this: we are not just enforcers of the law, we are representatives of justice, and justice has no room for prejudice, abuse of power, or feeble excuses." He walked out of the briefing room, leaving a palpable silence behind him. Some officers exchanged uncertain glances, while others bowed their heads in quiet reflection. James knew he had laid the groundwork for significant change, but he also understood this was just the beginning. Many challenges lay ahead. Immediately after the meeting, James Carter officially ordered an internal investigation into Officer Mark Grayson's actions. The investigation was assigned to an independent team within the department, led by Officer David Martinez, who had witnessed the morning's incident. James emphasized that the purpose of the inquiry was not only to address Grayson's behavior, but also to send a clear message about transparency and accountability. In the days that followed, tensions within the Elmwood Police Department ran high. The investigation quickly unearthed critical evidence, including video footage from Sarah, the bystander who had recorded the incident. However, what shocked the investigative team even more was Grayson's record. The files revealed that the morning's events were far from an isolated incident. Grayson, a veteran officer with over 20 years of service, had faced multiple complaints over the years for excessive force and discriminatory behavior. Some cases had even reached higher-ups, but for various reasons, lack of evidence or a desire to protect the department's reputation, the accusations were dismissed. One glaring example was a case 3 years earlier when Grayson was accused of unjustly detaining a black schoolteacher. The man had been held for 24 hours without cause before being released with no apology or explanation. Such cases painted a troubling picture of Grayson's repeated abuses of power. When the investigation team interviewed Grayson, he vehemently denied the allegations, insisting the morning's events were a misunderstanding. "I didn't realize he was the chief," Grayson said, his voice strained but defensive. "I was just following procedure. We all know Elmwood isn't the safest place. Who wouldn't be suspicious of a stranger driving a fancy car?" David Martinez, seated across from Grayson, fixed him with a steely gaze. "You call pointing a gun at someone without cause procedure?" Martinez retorted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I don't think our procedures include insulting people based on personal bias." Grayson swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking support. But this time, there was none to be found. Desperate, Grayson began leveraging personal connections to exert pressure on the investigative team. He met privately with John Miller, hoping to find an ally. "John, we've worked together for over 15 years, Grayson pleaded. "You know I'm not that kind of person. I need you to help me explain this to the team. It's just a misunderstanding." Miller, though sympathetic, was uneasy. "Mark, I understand you're trying to defend yourself, but this is more serious than you think. They have video evidence, and more importantly, Chief Carter isn't going to let this slide." Failing to gain Miller's support, Grayson reached out to other connections, including a retired senior officer who had mentored him. "We can't let this ruin my career," Grayson implored over the phone, his voice filled with desperation. "You know how hard I've worked. I need you to talk to the chief." But none of Grayson's efforts bore fruit. James Carter, bolstered by the investigative team's findings, stood firm. "Anyone who attempts to interfere with this investigation will face the same consequences," James declared. "I don't care about past relationships or personal ties. Justice makes no exceptions." After 2 weeks of diligent investigation, the team finalized their report. The conclusion was unequivocal. Mark Grayson had not only acted in a discriminatory manner that morning, but had a long history of abusing his authority. The evidence was irrefutable, and the team recommended his immediate dismissal. James received the report in his office, reading through each page in silence. He felt the weight of the decision he was about to make. Once he finished, he set the file down and gazed out the window, where sunlight streamed in. He knew this decision would not only end Grayson's career, but also shape how the Elmwood community viewed the police force moving forward. Picking up the phone, James called Martinez. "Schedule a full department meeting for tomorrow morning. I want this decision communicated to everyone." "Yes, Chief," Martinez responded confidently. The investigation had concluded, but James understood this was only the first step in a long journey to transform the culture within the Elmwood Police Department. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he was ready to face them because he believed justice was not just a duty. It was a sacred responsibility he would never shy away from. The next morning, the entire Elmwood Police Department gathered in the main conference room. A tense atmosphere hung in the air as James Carter entered, holding the final report from the investigation. Every eye was on him, some filled with hope, others clouded with skepticism. James stood tall at the podium, his gaze sweeping across the room. He began in a slow but steady voice. "I want to start by thanking the investigative team for their transparency and professionalism. Their report has given us a clear view of the facts." He placed the report on the table and looked directly at the crowd. "Officer Mark Grayson has committed serious ethical violations and abused his authority. This was not an isolated incident, and it is certainly not a mere accident. After thorough consideration, I have decided that he will be terminated effective immediately, with no opportunity to return to the Elmwood Police Department." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncomfortable or disgruntled glances. John Miller, who had previously defended Grayson, stood in the corner with arms crossed, his expression openly displeased but silent. James raised a hand to quiet the room. "I understand this decision may be controversial, but I want you all to remember this. Abuse of power not only harms the victims, but also erodes the community's trust in us. If we cannot hold ourselves accountable, we do not deserve to represent justice." Following the meeting, the official announcement of Grayson's termination was released to the public. In the statement, James emphasized that the decision was not a personal attack, but a firm stand against misconduct. "No one is above the law, and any abuse of power will be met with strict consequences," he declared. As the news spread, the community's reaction was swift and divided. On one side were those, especially individuals who had suffered from police misconduct, who supported James's decision wholeheartedly. They saw him as a courageous leader willing to face challenges to bring about real change. Finally, someone brave enough to take a stand. A black resident said in a televised interview, "We've waited too long for this. James Carter is exactly what Elmwood needs." But not everyone was on his side. A vocal faction, including some retired police officers and conservative community members, criticized the decision as too harsh and a betrayal of the force. They accused James of using Grayson as a scapegoat to build his image. Grayson was a veteran officer, and now his entire career is ruined over one incident. It's unjust, a Grayson supporter declared during a local radio program. Within days of the announcement, tensions boiled over as a small protest formed outside the police department. The protesters split into two opposing groups, one holding signs that read "Justice for All" and chanting slogans in support of James, and the other carrying banners like "Reinstate Grayson" and "Stop destroying our police force." The clamor from the two sides echoed through the streets, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. From his office window, James watched the scene with a contemplative expression. This was not the outcome he had hoped for, but he understood that meaningful change often came with resistance. Below, the supporters and detractors began engaging in heated arguments, some of which escalated into minor scuffles. Police officers intervened to maintain order, but James issued strict instructions. No use of force unless necessary. We must not escalate the situation. That evening, James held a press conference to address questions from the media and the community. Reporters fired off relentless questions, some accusatory in tone. "Chief Carter, do you think your decision has divided Elmwood rather than uniting it?" James looked directly at the reporter and replied in a calm but resolute voice, "I believe that sometimes, to heal, we must first remove what has decayed. This is not division. It's the first step toward rebuilding trust. I didn't make this decision to please everyone. I made it because it was the right thing to do." As the press conference concluded, James returned to his office, feeling the weight of the pressures bearing down on him. Yet he knew he had chosen the right path. People like Grayson had no place in the force, and for Elmwood to move forward, such changes were inevitable. Despite the ongoing tension, signs of progress began to emerge. Some community members, especially those from marginalized groups, started expressing renewed hope in the police force. One resident emailed James, writing, "Chief Carter, I never thought I'd trust the police, but today I feel a glimmer of hope." James read the email and thought to himself, if even one person feels the change, that's a victory. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready to keep fighting, for Elmwood, for justice, and for the values he believed in. After announcing the decision to terminate Mark Grayson, James Carter realized that a single action would not be enough to bring about deep cultural change within the Elmwood Police Department. To rebuild trust with the community, he had to start from within, by transforming how the officers themselves understood responsibility, bias, and the power they wielded. At the weekly, full-staff meeting, James entered the room carrying a folder of materials. He stood at the podium, surveying the familiar faces from past meetings. Some appeared at ease, but many still wore guarded expressions, particularly John Miller and his group of veteran officers who had openly opposed James's earlier decisions. James set the folder on the table and began. I want all of you to understand that Grayson's case was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a problem that has existed in this system for far too long. And if we don't change, Elmwood will never move forward. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Starting next week, every officer, regardless of rank or experience, will participate in a mandatory training course on bias awareness and elimination. This course isn't just about understanding the community we serve, it's about examining our actions and attitudes in this line of work. Murmurs erupted across the room. Some officers turned to whisper to each other, while a few openly displayed their dissatisfaction. John Miller, ever the spokesperson for the veterans, stood up to break the silence. "Chief Carter," he said, his tone calm but opposing, "I don't think this is necessary. We've worked in this field for years, and I believe we know our community better than any training could teach us." James turned to Miller, his gaze steady. "You think so, Miller? Then why are we here today, discussing an officer who abused his authority for over 20 years without anyone stopping him? And ask yourself, how many times have we ignored such behavior because we thought it wasn't our problem?" The room fell silent as James's gaze shifted to meet each person's eyes. "This isn't an accusation," he continued, his tone softening. "This is an opportunity to do better, to become the protectors of justice that our community needs." The following week, the bias awareness training began at a local training center. Officers attended in small groups to ensure everyone had the chance to engage in meaningful discussions. Initially, the atmosphere was tense. Many officers, particularly Miller's group, were reluctant and dismissive of the need for such training. "This is a waste of time," one officer muttered to a colleague as the trainer entered. "We have more important things to do." However, attitudes began to shift as the course delved into real-life stories. One officer, Maria Lopez, shared her experience. "Throughout my career, I've faced constant belittlement from colleagues simply because I'm a woman. They doubted my abilities, mocked my suggestions, and even told me I didn't belong in this profession." Her voice trembled as she continued, "But I proved them wrong. And I believe that to truly serve the community, we must dismantle these prejudices, not just against the public, but within our ranks." Maria's story left many officers speechless, some even averting their gazes in apparent shame at having contributed to or ignored such issues. Next, a young black officer, Terrence Hill, stood to speak. "When I joined the force, I thought I'd escaped the biases I grew up facing, but I hadn't. Within this team, I was doubted. People assumed I was hired just to fill a diversity quota. It made me feel like I had to work twice as hard to be accepted." Stories like Maria's and Terrence's opened up deeper conversations. Officers were encouraged to share their own experiences and reflect on the challenges their colleagues faced. Even some of the staunchest skeptics, like John Miller, began participating with a more open mind. Miller, who had been one of the most vocal opponents, eventually spoke up during a discussion. "I've been here over 20 years, and I always thought I knew how to do this job. But hearing these stories, I realize now that I may have overlooked things I should have paid more attention to. Maybe I need to change." Miller's admission surprised the group, but marked a significant turning point. As the training concluded, the atmosphere within the Elmwood Police Department began to shift. Officers started communicating more openly, and underlying prejudices seemed to diminish. Maria Lopez, who once felt isolated, found greater support among her peers. Terrence Hill also noticed increased respect from colleagues who had previously kept their distance. From his office, James observed these subtle but meaningful changes in how the officers interacted with one another. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but it reinforced his belief that change was possible. At the end of the day, he jotted a note in his journal. To change a community, we must first change ourselves. Elmwood is on the right path. As night fell over Elmwood, James Carter sat in his office, the light from his desk lamp casting shadows across his thoughtful face. The police department had grown quiet, with the last echoes of officers' footsteps fading into the stillness. While James could sense that small changes were beginning to take root, he felt the weight of immense pressure bearing down on him. He knew this was only the beginning, and every decision he made had the potential to trigger unpredictable ripple effects. At 9 p.m., James decided to call it a day. Driving home, he anticipated the comfort of his family waiting for him. Walking through the door, he caught the lingering aroma of dinner and the soft sound of laughter coming from the living room. The familiar warmth of home brought him a sense of relief. His son, Nathan, was laughing with his mother, Lisa, who had always been his steadfast anchor through life's storms. Lisa looked up as James entered. Her warm smile, though familiar, never failed to lighten his burdens. "You're late," she said, walking over and placing a hand on his shoulder. "There's dinner on the table. Do you want something to eat?" James shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, I'm okay, but I do need to talk to you." Lisa immediately understood. "Nathan, why don't you head upstairs and finish your homework so your dad can have a little quiet time?" she said, her voice gentle yet firm. Nathan nodded obediently, patting his father's shoulder before heading off. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You know that, right?" he said softly, bringing a fleeting smile to James's face despite the heaviness in his heart. Lisa led James to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and sat down across from him. "Tell me, James," she said, her eyes warm but serious. "You don't look okay." James leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. "Lisa, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. Every step I take seems to meet resistance. Some people in the department still don't accept me. The community is divided. And sometimes I feel like I'm fighting this battle alone." Lisa stayed silent, giving James the space to continue. "I know change takes time, but the exhaustion doesn't just come from the work. It's the sense that not everyone even wants to see things get better. And sometimes I'm afraid I won't have the strength to keep going." Lisa straightened in her chair, her eyes shining with the determination James had fallen in love with the first time they met. "James, listen to me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Do you remember why you started this career?" James stayed quiet, his gaze falling to the table as if searching for the answer in his memories. "I do," he said after a long pause. "I wanted to change what my father went through. I wanted to make Elmwood a place where Nathan could grow up without facing what I did." Lisa reached across the table, squeezing James's hand tightly. "Then don't forget that. You didn't start this job to be liked or to gain everyone's approval. You started because you believe in justice and change. And I know, no matter how hard it gets, you're not someone who gives up. Lisa smiled softly, her voice growing steadier. Look at what you've already overcome, James. The long nights, the days you worked from dawn until midnight, the sleepless nights filled with worry. But you rose above all of it. You climbed from a patrol officer to the chief of this department. That didn't happen by chance. You earned it through hard work, and you've proven you belong here. James looked up, his eyes warmer but still carrying a hint of doubt. Lisa leaned in closer. James, Nathan, and I are here. We believe in you. You're not fighting alone. There are people out there, in the department, in the community, who believe in you too. They need you to lead them through this. And if others want to push back, let them. They'll come around once they see how determined you are. Lisa's words felt like a small flame rekindling within James, igniting his resolve. He thought back to the promises he made to himself as a young boy witnessing his father's unjust treatment. Thank you, Lisa, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you. Lisa smiled, brushing her hand over his. Then don't forget it. Every challenge is just a test, and you, James Carter, have always found a way to pass. As the night wore on, James sat with Lisa, drawing strength from the love and belief she radiated. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. His family, Lisa and Nathan, were his greatest motivation, grounding his mind and heart in the relentless fight he had committed to. Before bed, James stood before the mirror in his room, looking at his reflection. Tomorrow is a new day, he whispered, and I will keep going. In the dim light of the room, his reflection wasn't just a man weary from responsibility. It was the image of someone ready to keep fighting for justice and the values he held dear. The next morning, James Carter entered his office feeling a renewed sense of determination. The conversation with Lisa the night before had helped him rediscover his purpose and motivation. Though challenges continued to loom, James was confident that the changes he was implementing were not in vain. The Elmwood community, long divided and disillusioned, was beginning to show subtle signs of healing. James's reforms, ranging from removing officers who abused their power, like Mark Grayson, to implementing mandatory training programs to combat bias, were starting to bear fruit. Over the past few weeks, the Elmwood Police Force has made tangible efforts to rebuild its image. Patrols were conducted with a friendlier attitude, and officers frequently participated in community meetings to listen to residents' concerns and feedback. Gradually, the wary and distrustful glances that once greeted the police were giving way to cautious optimism. Elmwood citizens, though still guarded, began to feel safer and more connected to the officers serving them. Local coffee shops, once hotbeds of frustration and gossip about the police, became venues for sharing more positive stories about the department's efforts. One such story involved Thomas Reed, a middle-aged man living on the outskirts of Elmwood. Years earlier, Thomas had lost all faith in law enforcement after witnessing his brother, a black truck driver, being stopped and roughly handled by an officer simply for driving through a neighborhood deemed off-limits. The memory of that unjust treatment left a deep scar, and Thomas has avoided interactions with the police ever since. But everything changed one autumn evening. After finishing his late shift at the factory, Thomas was walking home when two strangers confronted him in a dimly lit alley. They demanded his wallet, and when he refused, the encounter quickly turned hostile. Before the situation escalated further, a police cruiser happened to drive by and stop. Officer Maria Lopez, who had recently completed the bias training program initiated by James, stepped out with a calm yet authoritative demeanor. "What's going on here?" she asked firmly. The two men, startled by her presence, tried to flee. Maria acted swiftly, managing to apprehend one of the suspects while her partner secured the area. Thomas, shaken but unharmed, stood in awe. "Thank you," he stammered, his voice still trembling. "I didn't think the police would show up so quickly, or care." Maria smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's our job, to protect everyone, no matter who they are." Her sincerity struck a chord with Thomas. It had been years since he'd felt safe in the presence of law enforcement. Following the incident, Maria continued to check in on him, visiting him a few times to ensure he was doing well. This genuine care and follow-through began to shift Thomas's perception of the police. Thomas's experience was not unique. James's reforms and the changes within the police force were creating ripples of positivity throughout the community. More residents, once hesitant or outright fearful, began attending public forums with the police to voice their concerns and offer suggestions. At one such community meeting, an elderly woman stood up and addressed the room. "I used to avoid the police because I was scared of them. But now, I feel like they're listening to us. Thank you, Chief Carter, for leading Elmwood in the right direction." Sitting in the front row, James listened to her heartfelt words with a small, genuine smile. He knew there was still much work to be done, but moments like these reassured him that his efforts were making a difference. One evening, James received a letter from Thomas. In it, he wrote, "Dear Chief Carter, I never thought I'd write a letter like this, but I want to thank you and your department for doing the right thing. That night, Officer Lopez saved me, not just from harm, but from the distrust and bitterness I'd carried for so long. She reminded me that change is possible, and so is hope." James set the letter down on his desk, feeling a profound sense of validation. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but with every story like Thomas's, he was one step closer to his goal, transforming Elmwood into a community that the police and its citizens could be proud of. Looking out the window of his office, James watched as the streetlights glimmered in the evening air. Though significant challenges remained, he knew he was on the right path, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. Just a few days later, James received a report from Martinez, a trusted ally. The report revealed that a group of officers within the department, led by John Miller, was secretly opposing James's reforms. Their discontent went beyond mere disagreement. They were actively spreading rumors to undermine James's credibility. "Chief," Martinez began with a grave tone, "I've learned that Miller has been holding private meetings with some veteran officers. They're planning to pressure you into resigning." James remained silent for a long moment, his eyes darkening. "Thank you, Martinez," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I need to know everything they're doing. I'll handle this myself." Through Martinez and other reliable sources, James quickly uncovered Miller's plans. The group wasn't just spreading rumors that James was destroying the culture of the department. They were also deliberately delaying critical tasks, creating the appearance of chaos under his leadership. Even more troubling was their attempt to exaggerate minor incidents, painting a picture of James as a leader unable to control his team. One member of the group leaked false information about an internal issue, prompting local media to question James's capability. James knew that to end this, he needed to confront John Miller directly. One afternoon, as the station grew quiet, James summoned Miller to his office. The atmosphere was tense from the moment Miller walked in, his eyes filled with defiance. "Miller, I know what you're doing," James began, his voice calm but commanding, "and I think it's time we have an honest conversation." Miller crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. An honest conversation, Chief? I'm just doing my job. If there's an issue, perhaps you should look at your leadership. James's gaze remained cold and steady, unshaken by Miller's sarcasm. Don't play coy, Miller. I know you're trying to undermine me and sabotage the reforms I'm implementing. Did you think your actions would go unnoticed? Miller raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully controlled. I'm not sure what you're talking about. But if you think I disagree with some of your decisions, you're right. And I'm not the only one. James stood, his eyes narrowing. You have the right to disagree, Miller, but you don't have the right to sabotage. This isn't a power game. This is about the trust of the community and doing the right thing. You're playing a dangerous game, and let me warn you, no one is above the law, including you. Miller said nothing, his hands clenching at his sides. James continued, his voice sharper. If you think your actions will force me to step down, you're mistaken. I'm here not for power or prestige, but for Elmwood, for the people who've endured far too much injustice. And I won't let anyone, not even you, stand in the way of that. After the confrontation, James didn't stop at issuing a warning. He called a meeting with the entire department, publicly addressing the issue of sabotage. I know that some among us disagree with the changes, James said, his voice steady as he faced the crowd. But if you choose to undermine instead of engage in dialogue, you have no place in this force. He also ordered a comprehensive review of all officers' performance. This not only identified individuals who were neglecting their duties, but also sent a clear message. Accountability applies to everyone. The review uncovered misconduct among several members of Miller's group, including falsified reports and intentional delays in completing tasks. These officers were immediately suspended pending further investigation. John Miller, though not directly implicated, felt the growing pressure. Support for him within the department began to waver as more officers realized that opposition was not only risky but also damaging to the community's trust. A week later, Miller walked into James's office, his demeanor notably different. He looked at James with a subdued expression, the defiance gone from his eyes. "Chief," he began slowly, "I want to apologize for my actions. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I won't stand in your way any longer." James studied Miller for a long moment before nodding. "Your apology is accepted, Miller, but I'll be watching your actions closely from now on. Remember, this isn't about you or me. It's about serving the community." After Miller left, James gazed out of his window at the sunlight bathing Elmwood. He knew resistance wouldn't vanish entirely, but his handling of this situation had sent a clear message. No one, no matter their rank, is above accountability. Elmwood was changing, and James was committed to ensuring that change stayed on course. That morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Elmwood Police Department, carrying warmth and hope. James Carter stood in the press room, taking a moment to look out the window before stepping forward. Today, he was facing not only the media, but the community, ready to share the progress made and the challenges that lay ahead. The room slowly filled with reporters, citizens, and several police officers. The air buzzed with a mix of tension and anticipation. James stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room until they rested on a few familiar faces, those who had stood by him through the trials of recent months. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady and resonant, "today I stand here not to speak of achievements but to share lessons. Elmwood has been on a long and difficult journey, not just for this police force but for our entire community." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Over the past months, I've learned something vital. Change is never easy. It requires patience, courage, and, most importantly, the collective will of everyone involved. We've faced setbacks and resistance, but from those challenges, we've found the strength to rise and do what's right. Turning his gaze to a group of citizens seated in the front row, he added, "I know trust is hard to rebuild, especially when it's been broken for so many years. But I promise you this. We, the Elmwood Police Department, will not stop working to prove that we are worthy of that trust." James shared personal insights from his experience, emphasizing the need for humility and accountability. "I've realized that no one is perfect, not even those of us in uniform. Our job is not just to enforce the law, but to listen, learn, and correct our mistakes." He recounted the story of Thomas Reed, a man who had regained faith in the police after being helped by an officer. "Thomas is not just an individual story," James said. "He represents what we're striving for, a community that feels safe, respected, and protected." James didn't shy away from discussing internal challenges either. Change hasn't been confined to the community. It's happening within this department. We've faced deep-rooted issues, from personal biases to resistance against reform. But by confronting these problems instead of avoiding them, we've begun laying a stronger foundation for the future. Raising his voice slightly, James concluded with determination, "This journey is far from over. It's just beginning. But one thing I'm certain of is that Elmwood is heading in the right direction. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future." He ended his speech with a poignant message. "This is not my journey alone, or the journey of the police force. It's the journey of the entire Elmwood community, and if we stand together, there is nothing we cannot achieve." After the press conference, James stood outside the station watching people disperse. Some approached to shake his hand and thank him, while others kept their distance, still wary. He understood that true change would take time, but he wasn't discouraged. As the sun set, James returned to his office, where work awaited. He knew more challenges lay ahead, but the initial steps had sparked waves of change, small but powerful enough to ripple through Elmwood. In a quiet moment, James recalled Lisa's words. "You didn't start this journey to please everyone. You started it to do the right thing." And he thought to himself, doing the right thing is always worth it. A new day awaited, and James Carter was ready to continue his journey, a journey incomplete but filled with hope. James's story serves as a powerful reminder that change is never easy, but always worth it. If you were in James's position, would you have the courage to stand up and face challenges for a greater cause? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more meaningful content. Thank you for being part of this journey.